In late May 2026, Russia fired a reported $50 million ballistic missile, the Oreshnik, the one Putin claims no defense on Earth could stop, at a parking garage. Around the same time, Russian missiles hit the same McDonald's in Kyiv for the seventh time. And I know how that sounds. It sounds like a country coming apart, but pull up the frontline map and Russia is still attacking, still recruiting, still paying for all of it. So which one is it? There's a theory that says both at once. It says Russia is storing the war's damage instead of bending under it. And it says that every time Russia has broken in the last 100 years, exactly this, is what the final stretch looked like. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Domino Effect, the channel where we map the wars, the weapons, and the power struggles shaping our world one falling domino at a time. I'm Kevin, thanks for watching. The theory is called brittleness, and by the end of this video, you'll be able to apply it to any centralized system you like, not just Russia. History shows us that when Russian power breaks, it doesn't bend, and it almost never dissolves gradually. It snaps. In 1604, the collapse of a single dynasty triggered the time of troubles overnight. Central authority vanished, rival pretenders claimed the throne, and foreign armies occupied Moscow. In 1917, a brittle imperial autocracy pushed to the brink by World War I went from absolute rule to total collapse in a matter of days, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. In the 1980s, the slow bleed of the Soviet-Afghan war exposed a hollowed-out economy, acting as the catalyst for 1991, when a superpower holding 40,000 nuclear warheads dissolved into 15 separate nations practically overnight. And just 3 years ago, in June 2023, we saw a modern flash of this exact same dynamic. A mercenary column marching down an open highway toward Moscow, meeting almost zero local resistance because no bureaucrat or general had the authority to act without a direct order from the top. That's the essence of brittleness, a system so rigid, so tightly controlled from a single center that it can't absorb shock. Today, we're going to test this theory against 5 dominoes lining up inside Russia right now, in 2026. Fair warning, the theory promises something far stranger than a standard geopolitical decline. It tells us that if a collapse comes, almost nobody will see it coming in advance, including the men inside the Kremlin. So if you're thinking this sounds like every Russia falls next month prediction from 2022, good, hold that thought. This entire episode is kind of built on that. Russia's 2026 spring offensive failed, and its creeping gains have flatlined. That's the Bulwark's assessment from June, and it matches the maps. And yet, the attacks continue. Recruitment offices keep paying enormous signing bonuses and keep finding takers. The economy has dodged the recession, the default, and the popular revolt that sanctions advocates promised. 4 years of predictions about Russian failure have died on contact with a state that simply keeps functioning. A reasonable person looks at that record and concludes the system works. The brittleness theory looks at that same record and asks a colder question. What if a system can keep functioning and keep weakening at the same time? And what if this particular system is built so that nobody can tell the difference until it stops? To see how, you need one idea from materials science, which is a class I never took. But luckily, I work with some smart people. Steel and glass fail in opposite ways. Put steel under load, and it bends, it stretches, it deforms, it visibly complains, and every one of those complaints is information you can act on. Glass does none of that. Glass carries the load in silence, looking exactly as solid as the day it was made, while stress accumulates inside the material. Then one flaw gives, and the crack travels through the whole pane at once, just like our windshields. Political systems sort the same way. A flexible system survives by admitting that something is wrong. A free press prints the bad news. A commander reports the failed assault, and the system adjusts. A brittle system survives by pretending nothing is wrong, until pretending stops working. That's the frame. Keep that in your pocket for the next 20 minutes, because it's time for a subject I did take, history. And Russian history is about to hand us 3 chances to watch it in action. The year was 1917. In the spring of that year, after the February Revolution removed the Tsar, the Russian army still looked like an army. Headquarters still existed. The trains still ran. Ammunition still moved to the front lines. Officers still wrote orders, and the orders still traveled down the chain. On a staff map in Petrograd, millions of men still held a continuous line. What the map could not show was that after February, soldiers' committees in many units were voting on whether orders deserved to be obeyed. The chain of command had quietly become a chain of suggestions. In July, the provisional government launched the Kerensky offensive to prove the army still worked. It advanced for a few days, then formations began refusing to leave their trenches. The advance collapsed, and desertion, which was already rising, turned into a flood that grew month over month through the fall. By the end of the year, the Russian army existed mostly just on paper. And here's the detail I keep coming back to. The army dissolved while it still had millions of men, mountains of shells, and a functioning rail network. It dissolved because enough men stopped obeying, and obedience was the one input no depot could resupply. The Soviet Union rebuilt the army, won the biggest land war in history with it, and then spent the 1980s running the same experiment, but at a slower speed. The war in Afghanistan lasted from December 1979 to February 1989, and by the official count, it cost about 15,000 Soviet lives. A superpower can pay that bill for a decade, and the Soviet state did. The war never once threatened to break the army in the field. The damage landed where the Kremlin wasn't measuring. Mothers organized committees to count the coffins the state preferred not to discuss. Families coached sons toward deferments. Veterans came home to an economy that had no place for them and a state that pretended the war was just fine. A generation Russians came to call the Afghanistan, and a warning the state filed away unread. In 1986, the price of oil collapsed, cutting away the hard currency that made all the pretending affordable. And in February 1989, the Soviet 40th Army withdrew across the Friendship Bridge in parade order, flags flying, totally intact. The stress it had spent 10 years feeding into the system came home with it. 2 years later, the pain cracked. In August 1991, communist hardliners, led on camera by Vice President Gennady Yanayev, seized power in Moscow to stop the Soviet Union from liberalizing itself out of existence. Now, on paper, they held the strongest hand any coup has ever been dealt. Tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, more tanks than the rest of the planet cared to count, the KGB, and a state that had crushed every challenge for 70 years. They sent armored columns into Moscow on August 19th. And then the machine they thought they were driving simply failed to respond. Units took up positions and went no further. Commanders developed sudden communication problems. The KGB's elite Alpha group declined to storm the Russian parliament. Boris Yeltsin climbed onto one of the coup's own tanks and gave a speech, and the crew let him. You can see the moment the men at the top understood, because it was broadcast. At the coup's first press conference, Yanayev's hands were shaking so bad the cameras couldn't miss it. The coup lasted 3 days. The Soviet Union lasted 4 more months. It ceased to exist that December. The Soviet Union didn't run out of tanks in 1991. It ran out of certainty that an order from the center had to be obeyed. File that sentence away, because when we reach the fifth domino, you're going to recognize that mechanism instantly. So 3 stories, 1 shape. A system that looks intact on every map right until obedience, the one thing the maps never measured, runs out. Russia has carried monstrous pressure before, and history owes nobody a repeat. The honest way to use these stories is not as a prophecy, but as a checklist. So let's run that checklist. How many of those same stress signals are visible inside Russia in 2026? The first domino is manpower, and it cuts deeper than the version of that argument you've heard before. The crude version says Russia is running out of men, and the crude version is wrong. Russia keeps finding bodies. The real question is what quality of soldier the system can regenerate. By February 26, Media Azona and the BBC had confirmed over 200,000 Russian dead by name, and that's a floor, built only from graves and records they could verify, rather than an estimate of the true toll. The men in those graves included the trained core of the pre-war army. The Bulwark's June reporting finds Russia struggling to replace its losses even with massive financial incentives. And the Tony Blair Institute's July paper explains the numbers behind that. The army, the FSB, the police, and the Rosgvardia National Guard are all now recruiting from the same shrinking pool of working-age men, a pool projected to contract by roughly 10% by the mid-2030s. The war's burden already falls hardest on poor regions like Buryatia, Tuva, and Dagestan, which is exactly where the recruitment well is running driest. So the state pays more, trains less, and sends greener men to replace better ones. And what greets those men at the front, documented in the same reporting, is a culture where commanders extort money from their own troops, and soldiers have been shot for attempting to retreat, which tells you something about how the system plans to hold them there. That trade compounds every single month, and an army built from expensive, inexperienced men needs two things to keep fighting at all: machines and supply. So Domino 2 is the machines. Russia opened the war sitting on the Soviet Union's inheritance. Thousands of stored hulls and open-air depots and an armored cushion built for exactly this kind of grinding conflict. 4 years of attrition have eaten deep into that cushion. And what refurbishment pulls out of storage is increasingly 40-year-old metal. Meanwhile, sanctions cut into the imported machine tools and precision components that modern production runs on. The Tony Blair Institute documents Russian industry working around this through third countries, at higher cost, without full replacement. So the force substitutes: simpler vehicles, Iranian-designed drones, infantry assaults on motorcycles, because a motorcycle is cheap and a tank column is a drone magnet. Substitution keeps the war going. What it cannot do is rebuild the accumulated quality of a military, and that quality is exactly what's bleeding out. Quick pause before the third domino, because the third one decides the argument. If you want cracks like these mapped while they're still forming instead of after they reach the surface, subscribe to the Domino Effect. This channel exists exactly for that, and to showcase an American guy desperately trying to say Russian names and places for your amusement. Domino 3 is logistics. For most of this war, Russia's rear areas were effectively safe. Moscow largely solved the HIMARS problem with electronic warfare, and the supply system ran in peace. That protection is gone. By the Bulwark's June accounting, Ukrainian FPV drones are hitting Russian transport more than 90 miles behind the front line. When convoys switched to driving at night, Ukrainian crews started using drones to lay mines on the highways in the dark and let the trucks find them. The strike tempo has been climbing steeply since January. In occupied Crimea, civilian fuel is rationed where it's available at all. And Russian military bloggers, the people who cheered every previous phase of this war, are close to open panic about the southern supply lines. Translate that forward, because this is where specs become consequences. A frontline unit can have rifles, shells at the depot, and orders in hand. If the fuel and the trucks stop arriving, it stops being a unit within days. Francis Fukuyama described this exact endpoint in March 2022. An army that reaches the point where it can no longer be supplied and can no longer pull back, a collapse that could be sudden and catastrophic. I want to be straight about the date. He wrote that in the war's first spring, and it did not happen. It's a theory of how armies break, not a prophecy with a due date. 4 years later, the logistics picture is the closest reality has come to matching it. Domino 4, money. And this one demands precision because the overclaim is everywhere. Nobody serious is arguing that the Russian economy has failed. Moscow avoided the recession, avoided default, and kept the shelves stocked. What the numbers show instead is spare capacity draining away. Defense and security have grown to roughly 40% of federal spending, squeezing everything else the state does. Unemployment sits near 2%, which sounds like strength until you realize it means the labor market is empty, with Russian companies short roughly 3 million workers. The Interior Ministry reports police staffing gaps reached 40% in places because a patrolman can triple his salary by signing a combat contract. Even the sovereign wealth fund that cushioned every previous shock has been drawn down year after year to cover war deficits. A brittle economy can keep growing, but what it loses is the slack, the reserves, the spare workers, the fiscal headroom that used to absorb mistakes. The next shock arrives with nothing soft left to land on. Which brings us to Domino 5, the one that turns the first four from a manageable decline into a potential snap. Put yourself in a Russian colonel's chair for a minute. Your brigade stands at maybe 2/3 strength. You know it, your captains know it, but the last officer in your sector who reported honest numbers is commanding a penal company now, so your report says what the general wants to read. The general does the same thing with the report to Moscow. Every layer of the pyramid filters out a little more bad news, and at the very top, a man makes decisions using a map of an army that no longer exists. This is the exact mechanism from 1991, the one I asked you to file away, now with worse incentives. And Russia has already given us one live demonstration of the gap between apparent control and actual control. In June 2023, Evgeny Prigozhin pointed an armed column at Moscow, and it drove within roughly 125 miles of the capital before anyone meaningfully stopped it. It was neither a coup nor a repeat of 1991, and it fizzled within a day. But for those few hours, the world watched a state discover in real time how little it knew about its own coercive machine. Centralized control gives the Kremlin extraordinary power over what Russians see. The price is paid in what the Kremlin itself gets to see. A system built this way ends up hiding its weaknesses from its enemies and from its owners alike. So what would a snap actually look like? Skip the Hollywood revolution. The plausible versions are duller. There are three families of them. The specifics multiply. And I'll label them clearly because it matters. These are scenarios, not forecasts. Here's the military version. Ukraine breaks through on one starved sector. The reserves that exist on paper don't arrive in reality. Neighboring units pull back to avoid encirclement. And a local failure propagates down the line faster than a command system built on comfortable lies can react. Now, the political version. A battlefield humiliation big enough that the elite start assigning blame. And the competing security services, all underpaid relative to the actual war, stop coordinating and start hedging. Finally, the economic version. A fiscal shock forces a choice between another mobilization wave and cutting the payments that keep soldiers' families quiet. And some region simply stops complying. Notice what all three share. The trigger can be small. It only has to arrive after the system has spent its last reserve of flexibility. And one thing has changed since 1917 that should genuinely worry the general staff. Well, a lot of things have changed since 1917, but that year mutiny spread at the speed of a train. In 2026, a refusal filmed in one trench reaches every other trench at the speed of a push notification. The same Telegram channels the state uses for propaganda run in both directions. Now the caveat, which may be the most important part of this video. The Tony Blair Institute's paper, published July 7th, 2026, uses the word brittleness and then warns Western planners against the exact conclusion this video's thumbnail is tempting you toward. Russia, it argues, is entering structural constraint, but not collapse. Governments that build strategy on an assumed Russian collapse will be consistently wrong-footed. Russia still holds nuclear weapons, a vast repression apparatus, resources, willing partners, and a proven talent for absorbing punishment. The same paper's darker point is that constraint pushes Russia toward more brittleness at home and more disruption abroad. Sabotage operations against Europe and the US nearly tripled from 2023 to 2024, and that was before the pressure peaked. I can't tell you whether the snap comes, and I can't tell you when if it does. Nobody can, and anyone who claims otherwise is selling something. Brittleness leaves collapse optional. What it destroys is information. A brittle system's calm surface stops telling you anything about its actual condition. So come back to the pane of glass and count the dominoes with me. A trained force replaced by an expensive, inexperienced one. An armored inheritance spent down to 40-year-old metal. Supply lines under attack 90 miles deep. An economy with no slack left to absorb the next mistake. And over all four, an information system that hides their true depth from the only people positioned to fix them. That fifth domino is why this theory should terrify the Kremlin more than any weapons delivery announcement ever could. The theory stays silent on whether Russia loses. Its claim is narrower and worse. If the fracture comes, the men inside the Kremlin will be the last to know. In 1917, the maps showed an army that had already stopped existing. In 1991, the coup plotters commanded divisions that had already stopped listening. Everything looked normal, until suddenly it didn't. So 2 questions for the comments. First, which domino goes first? Does logistics starve the front before manpower quality breaks it? Or the other way around? Second, the harder one, would a sudden Russian collapse actually be good news for the West? Or would week 1 with the arsenal loose and the center gone be the most dangerous week of the century? Argue it out below. I read the threads. And if you want the next crack mapped before it reaches the surface, subscribe. Until then, we'll see you when the next domino falls.